Hello, geeks and ghouls. Let's talk Lovecraft and where to start reading Lovecraft. I first read Howard Phillips Lovecraft back 20 years ago. I was, a geeky guy. I have heard of this Cthulhu thing, and I went for the source. And so, yes, I read some of his stories and I fell in love with his style. I mean, I spent the next year reading everything I could get my hands on. I still have not read everything of his books, of his stories, for a reason I'll explain in a while, but I was under the impression that everybody who was into horror and science fiction and fantasy has read some Lovecraft. But I recently watched a video by a booktuber, which I cannot recall the name of the booktuber or what he read, but he was reading his very first Lovecraft story, and he was asking for opinions on what to read next. So I thought, maybe people are trying to get into Lovecraft and let's make a video about where to start. So I will suggest 5 stories by Howard Phillips Lovecraft, which can be your very first Lovecraft story. Of course, yes, I have to mention that it's the elephant in the room, and everybody's talking about this when Lovecraft comes into discussion at this point that Howard Phillips Lovecraft was racist and sexist, and he was too much of a racist and a sexist even for his era, which it was in the 20s and the 30s, and that speaks volumes. In a lot of his stories we have the non-white Anglo-Saxons being portrayed as demon-worshipping savages who worship elder gods and their cults, and a lot of the women in his stories are vile temptresses, mixing the white race with others. Does not specify that and not spoil some very iconic stories, is abominable, etc. It's very offensive. There are stories like the horror in Red Hook or The Street, which are downright offensive, even if you want to have an open mind. He was extremely racist and phobic. He had a lot of phobias. He was afraid of multicultural cities, of how different races mix, of modernity, of industrialization, and he also was afraid of small towns that were remote places, or he was pretty much afraid of everything. And I have to say that his style of horror relies a lot on his phobias, the fact that he was very afraid of others. He has a very distinct style and he can really creep you out. He's got this misanthropy and nihilism that was unique for his era, which was more like gothic horror and good and evil. No, he was an atheist, and a lot of his horror is based on the fact there's no good, it's only evil and no hope. And this has shaped horror. So reading him, it's important to understand the horror genre, and you can see his influence everywhere after that. His writing style is not easy, it's very baroque. He's often going for a lot of big and archaic words, and it's not an easy read, it's not a breezy read. But yes, at some point in his career he got an amazing writing style, and it's really charming, even though it's antique. So let's talk about where to start if you want to start reading Lovecraft. And I've got some very good news and some not so good news. The good news is his stories are public domain. They have been public domain for many decades now, so you can easily find Lovecraft stories. I mean, they're for free on the internet. So I'll leave links for the stories I mentioned below, and you can find a lot of cheap edition. I think there is even some free Kindle books of everything Lovecraft wrote. Personally, I have this book that collects all of the Lovecraft stories, all of the first category of Lovecraft stories, actually, because there are 3 types of Lovecraft stories. There are the stories that, and that's not so good news, there are the stories that he wrote. Then there are the collaborations, which are stories that he either rewrote for or ghost wrote for others, including Harry Houdini. There is a collection of stories of his collaborations, that I don't have. There's the cover on the screen. I don't have this edition. I've got a slimmer book, but I cannot find it. That's my copy of the collaborations. And actually my very first experience reading this book over here that only contained collaborations, and I first read the story The Mound that he co-wrote with Zelia Bishop, and it was an amazing novella. And Medusa's Coil, also a collaboration with Zelia Bishop, had me throw the book away because I was very creeped out by reading it. So yes, there are some great collaborations. And finally, there are his posthumous collaborations, where other authors, mostly August Derleth, have taken early drafts or ideas, or they even completed stories in which Lovecraft had zero involvement. And yeah, there are some great stories in each of those categories, but I will go for his main body of work, and I will pick 5 of them. First of all, you probably know Lovecraft because of Cthulhu, and he was the man who came up with this Cthulhu thing and the old ones, but the mythos as we know it was formed after his death, mostly by August Derleth and other people in the Cthulhu circle. In Lovecraft's work, the Cthulhu mythos is very loosely given, and it's mostly references to Cthulhu or the Necronomicon, and you can see a lot of them in his collaborations or in other people's stories, so it's not quite what you expect nowadays. But yes, the Call of Cthulhu is a pretty obvious choice. It is a 3-part story about the reawakening of an old one known as Cthulhu. Each part is revealing a broader part of the picture until we get to the final part, where we have some sailors facing against Cthulhu himself in his island of Erlia, who has risen from the depths of the sea. So yes, it's iconic, it's well beloved, and it's a good start in the Cthulhu mythos. There is action there, something not many of the Lovecraft stories have. There's a sense of mystery, of wonder, of the enormity of the old ones and how small we are compared to them. There's a lot of vintage Lovecraft in this one, and you can start here and then you can go further into the Cthulhu mythos, and I think there are quite a few stories on the core mythos by Lovecraft. But if we want to go for my number 2 choice on where to start with Lovecraft, I'll have to mention my second favorite Lovecraft story, The Caller from Outer Space. It's also a cosmic horror story, not a mythos one. The ending still makes my skin crawl. I had a video about this story a while ago, and it's about something that falls from the sky to a farm, and it starts changing plants, animals, and people. It's probably the best cosmic horror story ever written, in my opinion, and Lovecraft thought that it was his favorite story. And yes, Lovecraft hated most of his stories, so that should tell you something. It's an awesome story and definitely written. It's actually very well written. I reread this for the video and I was like, yeah, it's amazing. I know that many of you prefer longer books, so my number 3 is a novel, and Lovecraft had written 3 novels in his lifetime, and I'll go for the case of Charles Dexter Ward. It's great for Howard Phillips Lovecraft newbies. It's a story about the disappearance of a certain young man called Charles Dexter Ward. He was in a psychiatric ward after he lost his mind investigating an ancestor of his that had a dark past, and that's the end of the story. We start with the end, with this young man disappearing from his ward, and it's written in Lovecraft's signature reporter style. It goes to the past and how we got there, to the events that led to Charles Dexter Ward's disappearance. It's very iconic, it's very traditional, it is very inspired by European horror tropes. It's not cosmic at all, it's intricate, very well paced, it's full of twists, turns and chills, and Lovecraft can really give you a good chill. If there's a reason to read Lovecraft, it's because he can get under your skin. His ideas are and sense of pace and sense of unease are unique. You have to read him to understand why people are willing to go through his writing style that is very archaic, or his very bad opinions about things, because he can deliver that sales. And since we have spoken about novels, you'll find a lot of lists on where to start reading Lovecraft, going into his other two novels, but I wouldn't suggest them as a first read. The Dream Quest of an Unkadath is often mentioned, and Lovecraft has written some fantasy stories, mostly as homage to Lord Dunsany, and they're not what you expect when you think of Lovecraft and Cthulhu, so it's not an ideal first reading. And even if you want to go into the Dreamlands books, I would start with the short stories on Dreamlands, preferably the Silver Key, because they are mentioned in the Dream Quest of an Unkadath. It goes through all those earlier stories, references them, and the short stories have some charm in them, but they're not horror stories, and they're not his best work. His other novel, At the Mountains of Madness, is very well known and often mentioned as an essential Lovecraft reading, and I'll agree with that. It's essential and it's a great piece in the Cthulhu mythos. As you go further into the Cthulhu mythos, you'll have to read it. However, if it's your very first Lovecraft read, it may be too dry and too long, so it's not ideal for everybody. If you like Lovecraft style, yes, go for it, but I don't think it should be your first one. I think you should go from some of the other Cthulhu mythos stories before reading this one. That's my opinion, of course. Your mileage may vary, but no, I wouldn't start with it. My number 4 choice is very personal, and it's not often mentioned in those lists of best Lovecraft stories, but it's my favorite one. And it's very short and non-cosmic, very traditional horror story. It's called The Picture in the House. It's very, very short and macabre. It's about a man he's doing genealogical studies in New England, in Arkham. So there's a rain coming down, he goes into an old house and there's a creepy old man and they talk. The pacing and the story is amazing. There is a mounting horror building up and then it hits you and it's like, whoa. I love the story. It's very short and will give you a jolt of good old horror. It's very shocking for its era. There is a certain theme that Lovecraft returns to again and again in his stories that have nothing to do with elder gods, and it's here, and it's really hard-hitting. And speaking of his non-cosmic stories, I'll go for another non-cosmic horror story of his. My number 5 choice, The Rats in the Walls. It's a story that's inspired by Edgar Allan Poe, as a lot of early Lovecraft stories do. It's a man returning to his ancestral home, only to be tormented by the sound of rats in the walls. Content warning: there is a cat with a very offensive name. Again, when I say that Lovecraft was racist, I mean it. But if you're willing to read a very racially charged slur in a classic and disturbing story, this is for you. But it comes with a con warning that yes, the story is iconic, probably the best in a series of similar themed Lovecraft stories, but it has a con warning. Most of the stories have, but yes, this is explicit here. So yes, these are my 5 suggestions on where you can start reading Lovecraft. If I manage to unearth my copy of his collaborations, I plan to go through them because I have not read every one of them, but I will at some point. so I can do some suggestions there. I mean, Medusa's Coil and The Mount are definitely suggestions. They got me hooked, so maybe they will do the same for you. I would love to read your opinions in the comments below about, do you think that those 5 stories are good picks, or would you pick another one? Leave a comment below and like, subscribe, and yada yada yada. Thank you for watching and stay spooky.